My sister kicked me out of Grandma's house after the funeral. She forgot my name was still on the deed. Grandma Rosalie died on a Sunday in early spring peacefully in the same house she'd lived in for 43 years, the same house where I'd spent most of my childhood summers, learning to bake bread at her kitchen counter and falling asleep to the sound of her radio playing big band music through the wall. She left behind a will that split her modest savings between my sister Kelly and me evenly, and a house that, unbeknownst to either of us until the reading of the will, she had quietly added both our names to the deed for nearly a decade earlier, during an estate planning session neither of us had known about at the time. I found this out the same day Kelly did, sitting side by side in a lawyer's office 2 days after the funeral, both of us still raw, still moving through the fog of grief in that strange, disoriented way where ordinary tasks feel both unbearably hard and somehow unreal. The lawyer explained it plainly. The house belonged to both of us now equally as joint tenants, meaning any decisions about selling it, renting it, or living in it required both our agreement. Grandma had raised both of us in a sense during long stretches of our childhood when our parents were working double shifts to keep the family afloat. Kelly and I would spend entire summers at that house, sleeping in the same twin beds in the same upstairs bedroom, learning to can tomatoes and shell peas on the back porch, listening to Grandma tell stories about our grandfather, who died before either of us were born. Those summers were in a lot of ways the foundation of whatever closeness Kelly and I had as adults. We didn't always get along easily as grown women, different personalities, different life choices, the ordinary friction of two sisters who'd taken very different paths, but the house itself and our shared history inside it had always felt like solid ground beneath whatever else was happening between us. Kelly had been the one who lived closest to Grandma for the past several years, the one who checked in on her most regularly, drove her to doctor's appointments, handled the day-to-day logistics of an aging woman living alone. I lived 3 hours away, visited when I could, called every week, but I understood and never once resented that Kelly had carried more of the physical weight of Grandma's final years than I had. I assumed, walking out of that lawyer's office, that this shared ownership would simply be something we'd navigate together, thoughtfully, the way sisters who'd always gotten along reasonably well might handle an unexpected shared responsibility. I did not expect what happened 4 days later. The days between the lawyer's office and that Thursday were strange, suspended ones, filled with funeral logistics and phone calls with extended family and the particular exhaustion of grief that makes even simple tasks feel monumental. Kelly and I texted a handful of times during that stretch, mostly logistics, who was picking up the flowers, whether we'd split the cost of the reception, catering, small practical questions that gave us both something concrete to focus on instead of the larger, harder fact of Grandma being gone. Nothing in those exchanges hinted at what was coming. If anything, the tone between us felt closer than it had in years, two sisters leaning on each other through something neither of us had been prepared for, despite watching Grandma's health decline for the better part of a year. I'd driven back to the house that Thursday to start the process of sorting through Grandma's belongings, something Kelly and I had loosely agreed to begin together over the coming weeks. When I arrived, Kelly's car was already in the driveway, along with a small moving truck I didn't recognize. I let myself in with my old key, the one Grandma had given me years earlier, and found Kelly in the living room, directing two men I'd never seen before as they carried boxes of Grandma's china out to the truck. For a moment standing in that doorway, I genuinely thought I'd misunderstood something, that maybe this was some kind of donation run, boxes headed to a thrift store or a family member who needed dishware. It took several seconds of watching, of noticing Kelly's own furniture already arranged in what used to be Grandma's reading nook, for the actual shape of what was happening to fully land. What's going on? I asked, genuinely confused rather than immediately suspicious, still operating under the assumption that whatever this was, it was something we'd simply forgotten to discuss. Kelly's expression shifted just slightly into something more guarded. I decided I'm going to move in here. It makes sense, I'm closer, I already know the house, and honestly it's better for the property to have someone living in it rather than sitting empty. Okay, I said slowly, but we should probably talk about that together first since we both own it now. I already talked to Mom and Dad about it, Kelly said, as if that settled the matter entirely. They think it's the practical choice. You've got your own place 3 hours away. This just makes more sense for everyone. I want to be honest that in the moment I didn't immediately push back as hard as I probably should have. Grief has a strange way of making you doubt your own instincts, of making conflict feel like an indulgence you don't have the emotional bandwidth for. I told Kelly we'd figure out logistics later, that I wasn't trying to fight her on it right then, and I left that day without raising my voice, without demanding anything, simply absorbing the discomfort the way I'd absorbed most discomfort in our relationship for most of our lives. That discomfort curdled into something sharper over the following 2 weeks, as I watched, mostly through second-hand updates from cousins and family friends, Kelly settle fully into the house, repainting the guest room, replacing Grandma's old couch with one of her own, changing the locks, a detail I only learned about when I drove back down for what I thought would be a normal visit and discovered my old key no longer worked. I remember standing on that porch for a full minute before calling her, trying the key 3 separate times, convinced I was somehow doing something wrong, that the lock had simply stiffened with age the way old locks sometimes do. It wasn't until I noticed the brand new brass hardware, still shiny, clearly installed within the past few days, that the reality of what had happened actually settled in. Someone had methodically, deliberately replaced the locks on a house I owned exactly as much as she did, and hadn't thought to mention it to me at all, let alone offer me a copy before I found out by being physically unable to get inside. I called her immediately, standing on the porch of a house I now legally co-owned, unable to get inside it. "You changed the locks," I said. "Yeah," she said, in a tone so casual it took me a second to fully register how strange the casualness actually was. "Figured since I'm living here now it made sense to have my own locks. I can make you a copy if you want to come by sometime, just let me know in advance so I can make sure it's a good time." "A good time," I repeated. "Kelly, I own half this house. I shouldn't need to schedule an appointment to access my own property." There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could practically hear her deciding how to handle this. "I think it's better if I'm the one managing the house day to day, honestly. You're not around enough to really be involved in the upkeep, and it just makes things simpler if I'm the point person. I'm not trying to shut you out, I just think this is the practical setup." "This isn't about practicality," I said, feeling something in me start to sharpen into real anger for the first time since the funeral. "This is about you deciding unilaterally that you get to control a house we both legally own, and then acting surprised when I have a problem with that." "You're being dramatic," she said. "Nobody's trying to cut you out of anything, I just live here now, that's all this is." I hung up the call more disturbed than I'd been at any point since Grandma died, not just by what Kelly had said, but by how easily, how confidently she'd said it, as though she'd already fully convinced herself of a version of events where her unilateral takeover of a jointly owned property was simply the reasonable, practical outcome, rather than something that required my agreement at every step. I called my parents that night hoping for some clarity, some acknowledgement that what Kelly had done, moving in without discussion, then changing the locks entirely, was not a small thing. What I got instead was a version of the same casual dismissal Kelly herself had offered. "She's just trying to keep the house maintained," my mother said. "You know how these things go, someone needs to be the one actually there handling things." "Mom, she changed the locks, I don't have a key to a house I co-own." "I'm sure she'll get you a copy if you ask." "I did ask. She told me to schedule a good time to visit my own property." My mother sighed in a way that suggested she found this whole conversation tiresome rather than concerning. "I really think you're overreacting to this. Kelly's not trying to steal the house from you, she's just living there. Can't you two figure this out without it becoming a whole thing?" It became clear over that conversation and several more like it over the following weeks that my parents had already quietly decided that Kelly's version of events was simply the accepted narrative, that her proximity to Grandma in her final years had translated in their minds into some kind of earned right to the property itself, deed be damned, regardless of what the actual legal ownership stated. I found myself again and again having to explain a basic fact that shouldn't have needed explaining, that my name was on that deed exactly as much as Kelly's was, that grief and geography didn't dissolve legal ownership, and that being the sister who lived farther away did not mean forfeiting equal say in what happened to a house we both inherited together. I tried at one point during those weeks to appeal to my father specifically, thinking he might be more receptive to the practical, almost procedural nature of my complaint than my mother had been. "Dad, put aside the emotional side of this for a second. If you found out a business partner had unilaterally taken possession of shared property, changed the locks, and told you to schedule appointments to access what you legally co-owned, would you call that reasonable?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought I might actually be getting through. Then he sighed. "It's not really the same thing though, is it? This is family. Kelly's not some business partner trying to cut you out for profit. She's just settling into the house. I think you're framing this more adversarially than it needs to be. I'm not the one who changed the locks, Dad." "No, but you're the one hiring lawyers and sending letters," he said, and I realized hearing that we hadn't even gotten to the lawyer stage yet at that point in the timeline. He was already anticipating and preemptively criticizing escalation I hadn't yet taken, as though my grievance itself was the actual problem rather than the behavior that had caused it. That conversation stuck with me for a long time afterward, longer than almost anything else in this entire saga, because it revealed something about how my parents had already sorted the two of us into roles. Neither of us had asked for Kelly as the practical, grounded daughter simply doing what needed to be done, and me as the difficult, distant one causing unnecessary conflict over what they seemed to view as a minor procedural quibble rather than a genuine violation of my legal rights. The breaking point came 6 weeks after the funeral, when I drove down unannounced, partly to see the house, partly, I'll admit, to test whether Kelly's just ask for a good time policy was as reasonable as she'd claimed. I found her home, along with a boyfriend I hadn't formally met yet, moving what looked like the last of his furniture into what used to be Grandma's sewing room. "You can't just show up like this," Kelly said, meeting me at the door rather than letting me in, an actual physical barrier between me and a house that belonged to both of us. "I don't need permission to visit my own property, Kelly." It doesn't feel like your property when you're never here, she snapped, and something in her tone told me this had been building for a while, resentment she'd been nursing privately even while publicly framing herself as the reasonable one simply managing practical logistics. I'm the one who's been dealing with everything, the utilities, the yard, grandma's stuff still sitting in boxes because I haven't had time to go through it all myself. You get to just show up whenever you feel like it and act like you have equal say when you haven't actually done any of the real work. Her boyfriend, standing awkwardly near the sewing room door with a lamp in his hands, seemed to sense the temperature of the conversation and quietly retreated further into the house, clearly unwilling to be present for whatever was about to unfold on the porch. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, a near stranger tactfully excusing himself from a fight over a house he had no legal connection to whatsoever, while I stood locked outside a property that was legally half mine. I have equal ownership, I said, which isn't the same thing as needing to personally handle every task you've decided to take on unilaterally. Nobody asked you to move your boyfriend in here. Nobody asked you to change the locks. You made those choices on your own, and now you're upset that I have an opinion about decisions I was never consulted on in the first place. That confrontation ended badly, with Kelly essentially telling me to leave, that this wasn't a good time, standing in the doorway of a house I legally co-owned while I stood on the porch, locked out, absorbing the surreal experience of being asked to leave my own property by someone who had no more legal right to be there than I did. I drove home that night and for the first time in this entire situation stopped trying to resolve things informally through phone calls and appeals to fairness that clearly weren't landing. I contacted a lawyer, the same firm that had handled Grandma's estate, and asked what my actual options were as a joint tenant on a property where my co-owner had unilaterally taken exclusive possession, changed the locks, and was now actively preventing my access. What I learned reshaped how I approached the entire situation. As a joint tenant, I had every legal right to access the property, and Kelly's decision to change the locks without providing me a key constituted a real violation of that right. More importantly, the lawyer explained that if we couldn't reach an agreement about the property's use, whether that meant selling it, renting it, or establishing some formal arrangement for shared access, I had the legal standing to force a resolution through a partition action, a legal process that could ultimately require the house to be sold and the proceeds split regardless of whether Kelly wanted that outcome or not. I didn't want it to come to that. Grandma's house held decades of memory for both of us, and some part of me still hoped we could find a version of this that didn't end in lawyers and forced sales. But I also understood, finally with real clarity, that hoping for a reasonable resolution while Kelly continued acting as though sole possession was simply her right wasn't a strategy. It was just more of the same absorption I'd been doing since the day of that first lawyers' meeting, the same instinct to swallow discomfort rather than assert something I was legally and morally entitled to. I had my lawyer send Kelly a formal letter, laying out my rights as joint tenant clearly, requesting a key be provided within a specific timeframe, and proposing a mediated conversation about the property's future before either of us took any further unilateral action. I sent a copy to my parents as well, not out of spite, but because I wanted them to see in writing from a neutral legal source that what I'd been asking for the entire time wasn't dramatic or unreasonable. It was simply what joint ownership actually meant. Kelly's reaction to that letter was fury at first. She called me screaming, accusing me of trying to lawyer up against my own sister, of turning Grandma's death into a legal battle instead of grieving like a normal person. I let her get through most of it before responding calmly that I hadn't wanted this to become a legal matter, but that 6 weeks of being locked out of a house I co-owned, after being told to schedule appointments to visit my own property, hadn't left me many other options that actually worked. The formal process, once it started, moved faster than the informal one ever had. Within 2 weeks, Kelly had provided a key, more out of pressure than genuine agreement, I suspect, but a key nonetheless. We agreed through a mediator to a structured arrangement. Kelly would continue living in the house for the time being, paying me a fair market rent for my half of the equity, with a firm agreement that we'd revisit selling the property within 18 months if either of us wanted to at that point. The mediation sessions themselves were harder than I expected, not because the legal issues were complicated, but because sitting across a table from Kelly, formally, with a neutral third party present, forced both of us to say things out loud that we'd only been implying or avoiding in our phone calls. Kelly admitted at one point that part of what had driven her to move in so quickly without discussion was a fear that if we didn't decide fast, I might push to sell the house immediately, something she desperately didn't want, having spent so many of her adult years treating that house as an extension of her own home already. I understood that fear, even sympathized with it, but it didn't excuse the way she'd acted on it, unilaterally, secretly, in a way designed to present me with a fait accompli rather than a genuine conversation about what we both wanted. I admitted in turn that some of my anger had less to do with the house itself and more to do with a lifetime pattern I'd never fully named before that moment, a sense that Kelly's proximity to our parents and now to Grandma had always translated into a kind of default authority in family matters that I, as the sister who'd moved away for her career, was expected to simply defer to. The mediator, listening to both of us, pointed out something neither of us had quite articulated ourselves, that this fight was never really just about a house. It was about two sisters who'd never actually established, as adults, what equal really meant between them, and who'd let a decade of unspoken assumptions crash headlong into a legal document that suddenly made those assumptions impossible to ignore. My parents, watching this whole process unfold, eventually shifted their tone, though never quite fully acknowledging how completely they'd sided with Kelly's version of events for the first 6 weeks. My father called once near the end of the mediation process to say, somewhat awkwardly, that he understood now why I'd felt the need to involve a lawyer, that Kelly's approach had probably been more forceful than he'd initially realized. It wasn't a full apology, not really, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd gotten up to that point, and I decided to accept it as a start rather than push for something more complete. Kelly and I are civil now, in the careful, structured way of two people who have formalized a relationship that used to run entirely on assumed trust. We don't talk as often as we used to. And we do, the conversations stay mostly practical logistics about the house, updates about repairs, nothing resembling the easy closeness we'd had before Grandma died. I miss that closeness sometimes, genuinely, and I wonder occasionally if a different version of me, one less insistent on being treated fairly, might have simply let Kelly have the house and preserved the relationship instead. There's a version of this story where I tell you the 18-month mark came and went, and Kelly and I sold the house together, split the proceeds, and each moved on with a clean, unremarkable transaction behind us. That's not quite what happened. When the 18 months arrived, Kelly asked if she could buy out my half of the equity instead, having saved carefully over that period specifically for that purpose, wanting, she said, to keep the house in a way that didn't require either of us to watch strangers move into Grandma's kitchen. I agreed, and we worked out fair terms with the same mediator who'd helped us the first time, this time with considerably less tension in the room. Felt in a strange way like a small redemption arc neither of us had expected, Kelly finally doing formally, transparently, and with my full agreement, the thing she'd tried to seize unilaterally 18 months earlier. I still think about that difference sometimes, how the exact same outcome, Kelly keeping the house, felt entirely different depending on whether it arrived through honesty or through unilateral force, a distinction that mattered more to me in the end than the house itself ever did. But I don't actually believe preserving the relationship at the cost of my own rights would have been the better outcome, not really. What I learned through all of this is that fairness and closeness aren't always in conflict, no matter how badly certain family members want to convince you they are. What was actually in conflict was my willingness to be steamrolled and Kelly's willingness to acknowledge that grief doesn't erase legal reality, that proximity to a dying relative doesn't automatically convert into ownership, and that changing someone's locks on a house they legally co-own is not, no matter how it's framed, simply moving in. I think about Grandma sometimes in the middle of all this and wonder what she would have made of it, a woman who added both our names to that deed quietly, deliberately, presumably wanting both her granddaughters to have an equal stake in the place that raised us. I like to think she'd have been glad in the end that neither of us simply let the other one erase that intention, however uncomfortable the process of protecting it turned out to be.